On January the 6th, the world watched in horror as a group of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol, attempting to halt the certification of the 2020 US election results. The attack left 5 people dead and threatened to disrupt the peaceful transition of power from former President Trump to the current President Joe Biden. Reports perceived that the attack was deliberately planned by a group of far-right Trump loyalists, many of whom mobilized through fringe media networks like One America News and Parler. They used these platforms to air their grievances, inflaming Trump's rhetoric that the election was stolen. Witnessing this domestic insurgency continue to gain traction is heartbreaking because it undermines the very fabric of America's democracy. A democracy built on free and fair elections and the peaceful transition of power from one government to the next. Whether Trump remains as the leader of the Republican Party or not post-presidency is irrelevant because the movement that he has established will likely outlive his leadership of it. While there is a cult of personality surrounding Trump, a potential indictment from the New York State Attorney General's office will likely bring him down. These legal predicaments are likely to hinder his ability to lead the Republican Party into the future. Right-wing media disinformation has served to exacerbate existing tensions, pushing Trump's movement forward, whilst entertaining his conspiracy theories. For the better part of this century, outlets like Fox News and its more recent counterparts, Parler and OAN, have been feeding predominantly disenfranchised white, rural, working-class Americans a steady diet of highly opinionated propaganda, not grounded in any fact or truth. Whether it be fears that the nation is under attack by socialist Democrats, or that a deep state will forever alter their way of life, these news channels are watched and listened to by millions. Meanwhile, the corresponding retaliation by their perceived deep state, specifically the mainstream media, aka CNN and MSNBC, whose sole aim is to hold Trump's administration and their allies accountable for their actions, only serves to fuel right-wing media propaganda that the deep state is out to get Trump. Simply said, the more the Democrats and the mainstream media attack Trump for his numerous shortcomings, the more fervent the right-wing narrative. This has ensured Trump's electoral success. Even though he lost the 2020 election, he still gained 10 million more popular votes in the 2020 election relative to what he got in 2016. White grievance, or the desire to take America back to a segregation era, is a hallmark theme of right-wing media reporting. The habitual consumption of these news sources by Trump supporters has created a psychological dependence on them for information. Closing the minds of millions of Americans in this way deters the ability of anti-Trump platforms to influence their way of thinking. Therefore, the steady elimination of these inputs will not decrease radicalization within the GOP caucus of voters. If anything, Trump supporters will simply view it as another attempt by the deep state to terminate their cause. This us versus them mentality prevents any form of resolute reconciliation between America's left and right-wing divide. Media disinformation has also raised concerns about America's military and security personnel, assigned to protect politicians and business leaders. In December, Biden received a new security team filled with former Secret Service guards familiar with his time as VP. The replacement of some of Trump's former guards within Biden's team was swift due to concerns that they may believe Trump's election lies. There was also concern of a possible insider attack at Biden's inauguration by a handful within the massive military presence required to protect the Capitol after the events of January the 6th. With the advent of far right-wing conservative populism post-2015, we must ask ourselves, how did this happen in the first place? America is a country born out of a deep suspicion of government. The nation's founding fathers regularly cautioned against an overpowering authoritarian government suppressing the freedoms and civil liberties of its people. This idea of a limited government has been expressed time and time again. Whether it be Ronald Reagan's government is not the answer, or the NRA's push to preserve gun rights in a bid to protect citizens from a potential tyrannical government curtailing individual rights. Distrust of federal institutions is inbuilt within the nation's psyche. All politicians lie and deceive, the common view shared by many. Hence, a minimalist government accompanied by a vibrant, dynamic private sector is widely perceived as the ideal way for the country to function. Therefore, unlike other nations, public faith in government institutions has been historically low in the US. In the 1990s, Newt Gingrich was widely perceived as the founder of media disinformation, undermining democratic norms and hastening political polarization and partisanship. He exploited this historical mistrust of government using various multimedia channels, taking advantage of the birth of Fox News and, of course, the internet. Pushing forward the impeachment of Bill Clinton through trumped up charges and forcing government shutdowns. By indulging in pure partisanship, together with fringe government conspiracies, Gingrich paved the way for Trump's meteoric rise. Flash forward to the 2000s, the invasion of Iraq under the false pretense that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and the collapse of the economy in 2008, resulting in millions losing their homes, has further sowed a public distrust in government, specifically politicians. Regardless of whether they be Republicans or Democrats, the public perception is that they are both incompetent. While you may argue that Trump is a Republican, I very strongly believe that his rise is not attributed to his party, but rather his personality and views. His support is primarily based on an affection for Trump himself. Many of his most fervent supporters believe that he can relieve America of the chaos politicians have sowed for decades through their actions and constant infighting. As a result, his own inflammatory rhetoric is ignored by his base, who firmly believe that he is simply shaking the system. This is a mere illusion, but is regularly touted by Trump, who sugarcoats his erratic behavior under a plethora of conservative policies ranging from tax cuts to environmental deregulation, all of which is designed to keep moderates aligned and his most hardened supporters loyal. Even if he is fundamentally advancing his own agenda at the expense of everyone else, his support remains solid despite leaving office. But there's another important factor to consider. Why do so many people fall for these lies and support those who incite them with conviction? If we look at Trump's base of support, the one singular governmental policy that united them from the beginning is globalization, or in other words, its perceived failure to improve their lives, as seen in this graph. As you can see, it's shaped like an elephant. The graph tracks the total income growth of people in different income groups by percentile from 1980 to 2016. As illustrated, people in the bottom 40th percentile, or in other words, those in emerging LEDC countries like China and Vietnam, have experienced significant changes in wage growth, reaching a roughly 125% gain over the select time period. Meanwhile, those between the 50th and 90th percentile, as in people in OECD nations like America, have seen their wages stagnant, with growth hovering at a mere 45% over the past 30 years. All the while, those in the top 99th percentile, or the richest 1%, many of whom reside in America, have seen their incomes rise exponentially by up to 250%. This polarity in incomes is directly attributed to free trade and more broadly globalization. The wealthiest business owners have certainly benefited from these policies and expanding their networks overseas, raking in millions in cash. However, many of the workers, those in steel plants across rural America, specifically in Michigan and Wisconsin, fell left out of this dynamic. Their factories ceased operations, with many corporate bosses shifting operations overseas to take advantage of cheap labor. boosting their profits at the expense of the workers that served them for decades. As a result, many of the laid off workers experienced a mismatch between their skills and those desired by America's now largely service based economy. Favorable free trade policies by successive US governments and the corresponding actions of American conglomerates have left millions disenfranchised in the country's manufacturing states. The mainstream media has largely ignored the plight of these people for decades, instead, promoting predominantly neoliberal to moderate sentiment on their platforms. Hence, the resentment of this growing silent majority simmered unabated until Trump arrived and exploited it for electoral victory. In a way, he is the primary symptom of a much broader disease. Given the polarization of American politics, the actions of both Democrats and Republicans often repel themselves back into their respective tents, making unity hard. If there is one person who can heal this divide, it will be Biden. As the current president, Biden must work across the aisle with Trump supporters through his policies. He must address America's structural workplace problems, providing a credible means of alternate employment for laid off factory workers. He must also appeal to their sense of trust, specifically in politicians and government, to improve their living conditions. This requires a level of charisma and connection with people that Biden, now 78, lacks. His numerous public gaffes and diminishing mental capacity due to his age makes it difficult for him to do the rigorous work required to heal the nation. In addition, Trump, right-wing news media, and the Republicans have already portrayed him as an illegitimate president who stole the election with the help of the mainstream media. Hence, Trump's hardcore base of supporters will likely never truly respond positively to Biden's advances. Despite this, I would argue that Biden still has the potential to win over Trump's softer base of support. There are people within Trump's orbit that are more responsive towards a change of mind. Biden's administration must work tirelessly over the next 4 years to attach those forces to his coalition. In doing so, while Trump's support base will continue to exist, it would become smaller and more fringe within America's political spectrum. Diffuse Trump's concentration of support, and you have begun to solve the problem.